In the winter of 1970, in a judo dojo on a narrow side street in the Kanda district of Tokyo, a woman named Keiko Tanaka threw a 220-pound police officer so hard that his body left the mat entirely, traveled approximately 4 feet through the air, and landed on the wooden floor beyond the training area with a sound that made every person in the room flinch. The police officer lay on the floor for 6 seconds, staring at the ceiling, breathing in the slow, careful way that people breathe when their body is conducting an internal audit to determine what has been broken. Nothing was broken, but something had been rearranged, not in his body, but in his understanding of what a woman who weighed 145 pounds was capable of doing to a man who weighed 75 pounds more than her. Keiko Tanaka stood at the center of the mat, breathing normally. Her gi was barely disturbed. A strand of hair had come loose from the tight bun at the back of her head. She pushed it behind her ear with the calm, practiced gesture of a woman who had done this so many times that the act of throwing a grown man had become approximately as eventful as opening a door. She bowed to the police officer. He bowed back from the floor, because standing up felt like an ambition rather than a certainty. She was 28 years old, 5'6", 145 pounds, 4-time All-Japan Women's Judo champion, undefeated in competitive play for the last 6 years. But competition wasn't what made Keiko Tanaka extraordinary. What made her extraordinary was what she did after competition, the private sessions, the open challenges, the standing invitation that she extended to every dojo she visited, an invitation that had become legendary in the Japanese martial arts community, and that, on this particular evening, was about to intersect with a man whose name she had never heard. The invitation was this: any man in the dojo, any weight, any rank, any style, was welcome to step onto the mat and attempt to remain standing for 30 seconds. Not defeat her, not throw her, simply remain standing. 30 seconds on your feet against Keiko Tanaka. That was all. No man had done it in over 2 years. The dojo in Kanda was called the Sanshiro-kan, named after the protagonist of a famous Japanese novel about judo. It was a traditional dojo, which meant it had the aesthetic warmth of a meat locker, bare walls, high windows that let in slats of grey winter light, a training area covered in tatami mats that had absorbed so many years of sweat and impact that they had developed a particular smell, somewhere between old leather and wet earth, that anyone who has ever trained in a Japanese dojo recognizes instantly and never forgets. The mats were soft, that was the important thing. The mats were soft, and the floor beneath them was hard, and the difference between landing on the mat and landing off the mat was the difference between a bruise and a fracture. On the evening of February 7th, 1970, the Sanshiro-kan was hosting what the Japanese martial arts community called a Koryu Taikai, an open exchange session where practitioners of different styles gathered to train, demonstrate, and occasionally test each other in a spirit of mutual respect that was approximately 60% genuine and 40% competitive ego disguised as mutual respect. These events attracted judo players, karate practitioners, aikido students, and the occasional kendo fencer who wandered in, realized he had left his sword at home, and sat in the corner drinking tea. On this particular evening, the dojo held approximately 40 people. Most were Japanese, most were men, most were wearing the white gi of judo, or the white gi of karate, which looked identical to the untrained eye, but which the practitioners themselves could distinguish with the ferocity of religious scholars debating scripture. And in the back corner, sitting on a wooden bench, wearing dark slacks and a black turtleneck sweater and no gear of any kind, was a Chinese-American man who had been brought to the event by a Japanese film producer named Takashi Nishimoto. Bruce Lee was in Tokyo for 3 days. He was there because Nishimoto was trying to arrange a co-production deal, a martial arts film that would be shot in Japan and distributed across Asia. The deal would never materialize. The script was terrible, the financing was uncertain, and Bruce Lee would, within a year, sign the contract with Raymond Chow at Golden Harvest that would change everything. But on February 7th, 1970, none of that had happened yet. Bruce Lee was still, in the eyes of the international film industry, a moderately known television actor from a cancelled American show, and he was sitting in a Tokyo dojo watching Japanese martial artists train with the focused, absorbing attention of a man who never stopped studying. Nishimoto had brought Bruce Lee to the Koryu Taikai as a courtesy, a way to fill an evening, to show his guest something authentically Japanese, to build the personal rapport that Japanese business culture considered essential before any deal could be discussed. Nishimoto was not a martial artist, he was a film producer. He had no idea what he was about to set in motion. Keiko Tanaka had already thrown 4 men that evening. The police officer was the 4th. The first was a brown belt, who had volunteered with the eager confidence of a man who believed that his 60-pound weight advantage would make up for his 2-rank disadvantage. He lasted 9 seconds. The second was a visiting karate black belt who had announced, with the diplomatic tact of a brick through a window, that judo throws didn't work against someone who understood striking distance. He lasted 7 seconds. The third was a judo third dan, who approached the exercise with genuine technical curiosity, and whose throw, a beautiful uchimata that Tanaka executed at approximately half speed as a gesture of respect to a fellow high-ranking judoka, was so clean and so perfectly timed that several observers applauded. He lasted 14 seconds. The police officer lasted 11. After the police officer, the dojo had reached the state that these events always reached when Keiko Tanaka issued her invitation. The state where every man in the room was simultaneously fascinated by what they were watching and absolutely determined not to be the next person to experience it. The mat was empty. Tanaka stood in the center, waiting. The dojo master, a 70-year-old 8th dan named Sato Hiroshi, was sitting in his traditional position at the head of the room, watching with an expression that managed to convey pride, amusement, and the faint philosophical melancholy of a man who had spent his life teaching a martial art and had watched one of his female students surpass every male student he had ever trained. The silence stretched. Tanaka waited. The invitation stood. No one moved. And then Nishimoto, the film producer, the man who understood nothing about martial arts and everything about dramatic timing, leaned over to the man sitting next to him, a judo instructor named Yamamoto, who spoke passable English and who had been translating the evening's events for Bruce Lee. And he said, in Japanese, loudly enough for the people nearby to hear, "What about the American? He's a martial arts expert. Shouldn't he try?" Yamamoto translated this for Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee's response, according to Yamamoto's account, was to look at Nishimoto with an expression that communicated, with remarkable efficiency, both amusement and the recognition that his host had just placed him in a position from which there was no graceful exit. The people sitting nearby heard Nishimoto's suggestion. The whisper traveled. Within 15 seconds, the entire dojo knew that there was an American martial artist in the room, and the question of whether he would accept Tanaka's challenge had become the only thing anyone was thinking about. Now, here's what you need to understand about the position Bruce Lee was in at that moment. In Japanese culture, refusing a challenge in a dojo, particularly a challenge issued by the host or by a champion, was a profound loss of face. Not just for the person refusing, but for the person who brought them. If Bruce Lee declined, Nishimoto would lose face. The business relationship would be damaged. The trip would be wasted. This was not a casual social calculation. In 1970, in a Japanese dojo, these dynamics were as real and as consequential as any physical confrontation. But accepting the challenge carried its own risks. Bruce Lee was not a grappler. His art, the system that would become Jeet Kune Do, was built on striking, trapping, and footwork. He had studied grappling. He had trained with Jean Lebel in Los Angeles, and Lebel had taught him enough about takedowns, ground positioning, and submission defense to make him dangerous in close quarters. But judo was not close quarters in the way Bruce Lee understood it. Judo was a universe of grips, off-balancing, and leverage that operated by its own physics. And Keiko Tanaka was not a casual practitioner. She was a 4-time national champion who had spent her entire life mastering those physics. And then there was the mat, the tatami mat. Bruce Lee's entire fighting system depended on footwork, explosive, angular, precise footwork that allowed him to control distance, change angles, and generate power from the ground up. Tatami mats were soft, they absorbed energy, they swallowed the crisp snapping foot movements that Bruce Lee used to create his striking angles. Fighting on tatami was like running on sand. Every advantage Bruce Lee had built his system on, speed, mobility, the ability to be in one place and then instantly be in another, was compromised by the surface he would be fighting on. Keiko Tanaka, on the other hand, had been fighting on tatami her entire life. The soft surface was her home court. Her throws used the mat's energy absorption to off-balance opponents. When a man braced his feet against a throw, The mat gave way slightly, and that slight give was the difference between successful resistance and finding yourself airborne. Tanaka had built her entire game around this surface. She was a fish in water. Bruce Lee would be a bird in a cage. Bruce Lee knew all of this. He processed it in the time it took Yamamoto to finish translating Nishimoto's suggestion. And then he stood up. The dojo reacted. 40 people shifted their attention from the mat to the man in the black turtleneck, who was now walking toward the training area. He was small. That was the first thing everyone noticed. In a room full of Japanese martial artists, many of whom were taller and heavier than the national average, Bruce Lee looked almost fragile, 135 pounds, 5'7½". Though on this evening, without shoes, standing on tatami, he may have measured slightly less. He was wearing street clothes, he had no gi, he had no belt, he had no rank insignia, no school patch, no affiliation marker of any kind. He looked like a man who had wandered in off the street. Several of the judoka exchanged glances. The glances said, "This is going to be quick." Keiko Tanaka watched Bruce Lee approach the mat. She had been briefed, if you can call a 15-second whispered conversation a briefing, by Yamamoto, who had told her that the man was an American martial artist who practiced Chinese kung fu. Tanaka's experience with Chinese martial arts was limited to what she had seen in films and in the occasional cross-style demonstration. She respected all martial arts in the abstract, philosophical way that serious practitioners respect each other's disciplines. But she also knew, with the confidence of a woman who had thrown hundreds of men, that kung fu practitioners with their wide stances, their extended arm positions, their reliance on striking distance, were particularly vulnerable to judo techniques. They stood too far apart, they reached too far forward. They gave her the grips she needed. She expected this to be easy, not because she was arrogant, because every piece of evidence in her experience told her it would be. Bruce Lee stepped onto the mat. He removed his shoes at the edge, the way he had seen the other participants do. He bowed. Tanaka bowed back, and in that bow, that brief, mutual lowering of the head, something passed between them that Yamamoto later described as the most important moment of the entire encounter. He said that when Bruce Lee bowed, he didn't bow the way the other challengers had bowed. The other challengers bowed with tension, the tight, nervous bow of men who were about to be tested and who were bracing for impact. Bruce Lee bowed with what Yamamoto called real respect, not performed respect, not the obligatory respect of a man following protocol, a genuine, unhurried acknowledgement of the person standing across from him. And when he came up from the bow, his eyes met Tanaka's, and what was in those eyes was not the competitive fire that she had seen in every other challenger. It was curiosity, pure, undiluted, almost childlike curiosity, the look of a man who was about to learn something. Tanaka saw this, and something in her own expression changed. The polished, professional readiness that she wore like armor softened, just a fraction, just enough that someone paying very close attention might notice. She was curious too, because the man standing across from her didn't look like anyone she had ever faced. He didn't stand like a judoka. He didn't stand like a karate player. He didn't stand like anything she recognized. His weight was centered over his feet, in a way that suggested he could move in any direction at any time. His hands were low below his waist, which in judo was an invitation to be gripped and thrown. But the way he held them, loose and alive and somehow watchful, made Tanaka hesitate in a way she hadn't hesitated in years. Sato Hiroshi, the dojo master, signaled the beginning. What happened next was not a fight, it was a conversation. The most extraordinary martial arts conversation that anyone in that dojo had ever witnessed. And like all great conversations, it began with a question. Tanaka stepped forward. In judo, the opening exchange is called kumikata, the grip fighting, the battle for dominant hand position that determines who controls the throw. Tanaka's right hand reached for Bruce Lee's collar, the standard grip, the anchor point from which every major judo throw is launched. Her left hand reached for his sleeve. She got neither. Bruce Lee's hands moved, not to block, not to strike, but to redirect. He used the backs of his wrists to guide Tanaka's gripping hands past their targets, the way a man might use his palm to redirect a stream of water. The motion was soft, almost gentle. There was no impact, no collision, just a fluid, circular deflection that sent Tanaka's hands sliding past the fabric they were reaching for and into empty space. Tanaka reset. She stepped forward again. This time she was faster, a committed entry, the kind of explosive grip seizure that she used in competition against opponents who tried to play the distance game. Her right hand shot toward Bruce Lee's lapel like a striking snake. Bruce Lee wasn't there. He had shifted, not backward, which was what Tanaka expected, but laterally, a half step to his left that changed the angle between them by about 15 degrees. It was a small movement. It shouldn't have been enough. But Tanaka's hand closed on air instead of fabric, and the forward momentum of her grip attempt carried her slightly past Bruce Lee, which created a moment, a fraction of a second, where her back was partially turned to him and her balance was committed forward. In that fraction of a second, Bruce Lee could have struck her. The back of her neck was exposed, her ribs were open, a dozen different attacks were available, any of which would have ended the encounter instantly. 40 people in the dojo held their breath, because 40 people saw the opening, and 40 people expected the strike. Bruce Lee didn't strike, he touched her shoulder, light with his fingertips, the way you might tap someone on the shoulder to get their attention, and then he stepped back. The touch said, "I was here. I could have been here with force. I chose not to." Tanaka turned. She looked at Bruce Lee, and the expression on her face underwent a transformation that Yamamoto said he would remember for the rest of his life. The professional readiness was gone. The competitive focus was gone. What replaced them was recognition. Not recognition of who Bruce Lee was. She still had no idea. Recognition of what Bruce Lee was. She was standing across from someone who operated at her level, not in her art, not in her techniques, but at her level of understanding, that deep, structural level where martial arts stops being about styles and techniques and becomes about the human body's relationship with space, time, balance, and intention. She smiled. It was a small smile, private, the kind of smile that one musician gives another when they hear a phrase played in a way they've never heard before but instantly recognize as correct. Then she came at him again, and this time she wasn't playing the challenge game. She wasn't trying to throw him in 30 seconds for the entertainment of the dojo. She was engaging, fully with everything she had, not to hurt him, to find out what he could do. The next 90 seconds were described by Sato Hiroshi, the 70-year-old 8th Dan who had been watching judo for over 50 years, as the most beautiful martial arts exchange he had ever seen. He said it in an interview with a Japanese martial arts publication in 1988, 18 years after it happened, and the interviewer noted that Sato's voice trembled when he described it. Not from age, from the memory. Tanaka attacked with combinations, grip attempts flowing into foot sweeps, flowing into hip entries, flowing into sacrifice techniques. She was magnificent. Her judo was a continuous, adaptive, flowing assault that gave Bruce Lee no time to set his feet, no time to establish his preferred striking distance, no time to do anything except move, redirect, and survive. She was forcing him into her world, the close-range, grip-dependent, balance-destroying world of competitive judo, and she was doing it with the relentless, suffocating pressure that had overwhelmed every man she had ever faced. And Bruce Lee was surviving. Not by fighting her judo with his kung fu, not by imposing his system on hers. He was surviving by doing something that no one in the dojo had ever seen a non-judoka do. He was adapting in real time. Every exchange taught him something. Every grip attempt she made, he responded differently than the last time. She reached for his collar, and the first time he deflected with his wrists, and the second time he angled his body to deny the grip, and the third time he stepped into her entry, instead of away from it, which collapsed the distance she needed for the throw and turned her own forward momentum into a disadvantage. He was learning her, in real time, on the mat, under pressure. With 40 people watching, he was downloading her patterns, cataloging her tendencies, mapping the architecture of her judo, and adjusting his responses faster than she could adjust her attacks, and Tanaka could feel it happening. She could feel the man across from her getting better with every exchange. Not in large, dramatic jumps, but in small, precise calibrations that closed off one option after another. It was like fighting someone who was reading her mind, except he wasn't reading her mind. He was reading her body, reading the micro-tensions in her shoulders that telegraphed the direction of her next entry, reading the weight shifts in her feet that revealed which throw she was loading, reading the rhythm of her breathing to predict the timing of her explosions. But Tanaka was a champion, and champions don't run out of options. They create new ones. At approximately the 70-second mark, estimates vary, because no one was timing this, because no one had expected it to last longer than 10 seconds. Tanaka made her move. She had been driving Bruce Lee backward, toward the edge of the mat, compressing his space, reducing his angles, forcing him into the corner where the mat met the wooden floor. It was a strategic relocation, the judo equivalent of a chess player advancing their pawns to restrict the opponent's movement. And when Bruce Lee's back foot touched the edge of the mat, when he had nowhere left to go without stepping off the training surface, Tanaka launched the throw that had won her 4 national championships, a soto-gari, the major outer reap, Tanaka's signature technique. She had thrown over 300 men with this technique in competition and training. The entry was flawless, a simultaneous grip on Bruce Lee's collar and sleeve, a powerful step past his right foot, and the sweeping strike of her right leg against the back of his right leg. The physics of osotogari are elegant and brutal. The upper body is pulled forward, while the lower body is swept backward, and the victim rotates through the air like a wheel and hits the mat with the flat of their back. Tanaka executed the entry perfectly. Her grips were locked, her leg was sweeping. Bruce Lee's right foot was leaving the ground. He was going over. Every person in the dojo could see it. The throw was happening. Keiko Tanaka was about to add another man to the list. And then Bruce Lee did something that Sato Hiroshi said he had never seen in 50 years of judo. Something that violated the fundamental assumptions of the throw in a way that Sato could not explain using the vocabulary of his art. As Bruce Lee's body began to rotate, as the throw committed him to the air, his left arm, the arm that Tanaka was gripping at the sleeve, went completely limp. Not tense, not resistant, limp, dead weight. The sleeve fabric went slack in Tanaka's grip, and the sudden absence of tension, the sudden disappearance of the force she was pulling against, disrupted the rotational mechanics of the throw. It was as if she had been pulling a rope, and someone had cut it. Her own pulling force, meeting no resistance, caused her upper body to lean backward slightly. A fraction of an inch, nothing visible to the untrained eye. But Bruce Lee felt it, and in the same instant that his arm went limp, his right arm, the free arm, the arm that wasn't being gripped, wrapped around Tanaka's waist. Not to strike, not to hit, to hold. He pulled her toward him as he fell, converting Tanaka's throw into a mutual descent. They fell together, not with the violent, one-sided impact of a successful osotogari, but with a controlled, almost graceful collapse onto the mat, with Bruce Lee on his back and Tanaka on top of him. In judo scoring, this was a throw. Tanaka had put Bruce Lee on his back. In any competition, the referee would have awarded ippon, full point, match over. By the rules of judo, Keiko Tanaka had won. But the dojo was not a competition, and what happened in the half-second after they landed told a different story. Bruce Lee, from his back, with Tanaka's weight on his chest and her grip still locked on his gi, he had borrowed a gi top from Yamamoto before stepping onto the mat, executed a movement that came from somewhere outside the vocabulary of any single martial art. His hips shifted, his legs scissored, and in a motion that was half wrestling escape, half Wing Chun sensitivity, and half something that had no name, he reversed the position. Tanaka, who had been on top, was now on the mat. Bruce Lee, who had been thrown, was now kneeling beside her, one hand on the mat, the other hand hovering open, palm down over her sternum. He hadn't struck her. His hand was 6 inches above her chest, not touching, hovering. The way a calligrapher holds a brush above the paper in the instant before the first stroke. The hand said everything. It said, "This is where the strike would go. This is how close I am, and I am choosing in this moment not to put it there." The dojo was silent, not the uncomfortable silence of an audience watching something go wrong, the sacred silence of an audience watching something go right, the silence of 40 people who understood that what they had just witnessed was not a fight, it was not a demonstration, it was not a test, it was something that transcended all of those categories and entered a space that most martial artists spend their entire lives trying to reach and never do. 2 masters, 2 different arts, 2 completely different philosophies of combat, meeting on a mat in a dojo in Tokyo on a winter evening and discovering through their bodies, through their movement, through the wordless, physical language of conflict that they were speaking the same language, different dialects, different accents, different vocabularies, but the same language. Tanaka looked up at Bruce Lee's hovering hand, then she looked at his face, and she laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not a defeated laugh, a genuine, open, full-hearted laugh, the laugh of a woman who had just experienced something delightful and unexpected and profound, the laugh of a person who has been given a gift they didn't know they wanted. Bruce Lee smiled. He withdrew his hand. He stood up. He offered his hand to Tanaka. She took it. He pulled her to her feet, and they stood there, in the center of the mat, facing each other, and the laughter in Tanaka's eyes was mirrored by something in Bruce Lee's eyes that Yamamoto described as joy. Pure, uncomplicated joy. The joy of a man who had walked into a room, met someone extraordinary, and learned something he couldn't have learned any other way. They bowed to each other. This bow was different from the first one. The first bow had been protocol. This bow was personal, deep, slow. The bow that two people give each other when words are inadequate and the body must say what the mouth cannot. The dojo erupted. 40 people, many of whom had been holding their breath for the better part of 2 minutes, released the accumulated tension in a wave of applause that shook the high windows. Sato Hiroshi was clapping from his position at the head of the room, and Yamamoto noted that Sato's eyes were wet, which was something none of his students had ever seen before. But the story doesn't end on the mat. After the exchange, Tanaka and Bruce Lee sat together in the corner of the dojo, drinking green tea, talking through Yamamoto's translation. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. The Koryu Taikai continued around them, other practitioners demonstrating, sparring, training. But the center of gravity in the room had shifted, permanently to the corner where a Chinese-American man in a black turtleneck and a Japanese woman in a white gi were engaged in what Yamamoto described as the most intense and detailed technical conversation he had ever translated. Tanaka asked Bruce Lee about the arm, the moment when his arm went limp during the throw. She wanted to understand the principle. Bruce Lee explained it using a concept he called non-resistance, the idea that you do not fight force with force. You become empty at the point of contact, allowing the opponent's force to pass through you without meeting the resistance it was designed to overcome. He said, "You were pulling my sleeve. Your throw needed my arm to be rigid, because the throw uses the rigidity as a lever. I removed the lever. Without the lever, the machine doesn't work." Tanaka's eyes widened. She said, and Yamamoto translated with the slightly stunned inflection of a man who was hearing something he had never considered. She said, "That is the principle of judo, due to softness, due the way, the soft way. You used the principle of judo to defeat the technique of judo." Bruce Lee nodded, and then he said something that Yamamoto said he wrote down on a napkin that evening and kept in his desk drawer for the next 35 years. Bruce Lee said, "Your judo is not Japanese. My kung fu is not Chinese. They belong to the same place. They come from the same understanding. The styles are different. The truth is the same." Tanaka stared at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Who are you?" Nishimoto, the film producer, leaned forward. This was the moment he had been waiting for. He said, with the pride of a man presenting a business card, "This is Bruce Lee. He was the star of the Green Hornet in America." Tanaka shook her head. She hadn't heard of the Green Hornet. She hadn't heard of Bruce Lee. The name meant nothing to her. And Bruce Lee, according to Yamamoto, smiled at this, a real smile, not a polite one. The smile of a man who was relieved to be unknown. Because being unknown meant that what had happened on the mat was pure. It was not influenced by reputation or expectation or the weight of a name. It was two bodies meeting, two systems conversing, and the truth that emerged belonged to the conversation itself, not to the people having it. They exchanged contact information. Tanaka gave Bruce Lee her dojo address. Bruce Lee gave Tanaka the address of his school in Los Angeles. There is no evidence that they ever communicated again. Bruce Lee returned to the United States 2 days later. Within 18 months, he would film The Big Boss and become the most famous martial artist on the planet. Within 3 years, he would be dead. Keiko Tanaka continued competing for another 4 years. She won 2 more All-Japan championships. She retired in 1974 and opened her own dojo in Yokohama, where she taught for over 2 decades. She never spoke publicly about the evening at the Sanshiro-kan. When asked about it by the Japanese martial arts publication that interviewed Sato Hiroshi in 1988, she declined to comment, saying only, and this was translated from the Japanese, "Some things belong to the mat." But Sato Hiroshi spoke, and what he said in that interview carries the weight of a man who had dedicated his entire life to understanding what martial arts could be at their highest level. He said, "In 50 years of watching judo, I have seen 10,000 throws. I have seen beautiful technique. I have seen power and speed and grace. But I have only once seen two martial artists find each other. I mean truly find each other. The way two instruments find the same key in the middle of different songs. It happened on my mat, in my dojo. And I understood in that moment that judo is not a style. Kung fu is not a style. They are both fingers pointing at the same moon. He paused. The interviewer waited. The American understood this, Sato said. He understood it in his body, not just in his mind. And Keiko understood it too. That is why she laughed. She was not laughing because the exchange was funny. She was laughing because the exchange was true. And truth, when you encounter it unexpectedly, sometimes makes you laugh, because you realize that the thing you have been searching for your entire life was standing 3 feet in front of you, wearing a black turtleneck, and you almost missed it. That phrase, fingers pointing at the same moon, was not original to Seto Hiroshi. It was a Zen Buddhist metaphor that had been used for centuries. But it was also, word for word, a phrase that Bruce Lee had used in his own writings, in his own philosophy, in his own attempt to articulate the idea that all martial arts, at their deepest level, are expressions of the same human truth. And Bruce Lee wrote it, Sato Hiroshi said it, Keiko Tanaka lived it. 3 people, 3 different arts, 3 different countries, 3 different languages, arriving at the same point from 3 completely different directions. And they arrived there not through philosophy books or meditation retreats or theoretical debates. They arrived there on a tatami mat, on a cold February evening, in a dojo in Kanda, through the only language that the body truly understands: contact, resistance, softness, truth. The Sanshiro-kan dojo closed in 2003. The building was converted into an office space. The mats were removed. The wooden floor was covered with carpet. The high windows that had let in the grey winter light on the evening when Bruce Lee and Keiko Tanaka met were replaced with double-glazed panels. There is nothing left of what happened there. No plaque, no photograph, no record except the memories of the people who were present, most of whom are now gone. But if you had been there, if you had been sitting on the wooden bench at the edge of the training area, watching a woman in a white gi and a man in street clothes bow to each other and then begin to move, you would have seen something that most people spend their entire lives in martial arts without ever witnessing. You would have seen 2 people stop fighting each other and start fighting toward each other, not with violence, not with dominance, with the kind of honest, vulnerable, full-hearted engagement that happens when 2 human beings decide, in the same moment, that understanding is more important than winning. She threw him, he reversed her, she laughed, he smiled, and somewhere in the space between the throw and the reversal, between the laughter and the smile, the oldest question in martial arts, which style is best, was answered. None of them, all of them, and it depends entirely on who is standing on the mat. If this story changed the way you think about fighting, if it made you realize that the deepest martial arts encounters aren't about who hits harder, but about who listens better, then share it with someone who trains, someone who teaches, someone who has ever stood across from another person and tried to understand them through movement instead of words. And subscribe to this channel, because the next story I'm going to tell you is about the only person who ever made Bruce Lee stop mid-technique and ask to be taught. Not a master, not a champion. A 9-year-old girl in a park in San Francisco, and what she showed him in 45 seconds rewired something in Bruce Lee's understanding of the human body that he had been trying to solve for a decade. You don't want to miss it.